Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube channel where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Joseph McBride, who is a film historian, and he recently retired as a professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He is the author of biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg, 3 books on Orson Welles, and critical studies of Ernst Lubitsch, Billy Wilder, and the Coen brothers. He acted for Welles in The Other Side of the Wind and has won a Writers Guild of America award. Joseph, welcome back. Thanks for coming again.
Thank you for having me again. It's always fun.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. I've read, I think about this my fifth of your fifth. Yeah, I think this is the 5th book of yours that I've read. This year, and there's, I certainly want to read many more. But as I know, we were emailing each other, and I love the book, and I know, I just listening to other interviews you've done, it's Cukor is one of those filmmakers where the name rings a bell, and then when you go through his filmography, you realize you've seen so many of these movies, but maybe I didn't always necessarily put Cukor to certain films like Gaslight, for example, which is so well known. But I learned so much, and I saw so many movies, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But I'm curious, what was the first film of Cukor's that you remember seeing?
The first one that I remember made an impression on me was My Fair Lady in 1965. It came out in 64, and this film was very important in my life. I tell people that the 2 films that meant the most to me as a person were Citizen Kane, which got me into writing about movies and wanting to make movies, but My Fair Lady, even before that, was the other one. The reason is, when I was in high school, Marquette University High School in Milwaukee, which is where Spencer Tracy went to school, he was in 6 Cukor films. And when I discovered that in 1964 that he had gone to our school from reading Pat O'Brien's autobiography, which Pat O'Brien went there too, I was very excited, and I told my favorite priest, and he said, "Spencer Tracy, he shacked up with that Hepburn woman, and he's never given a penny to the school." Which I thought was kind of churlish about our greatest alumnus, but but that school was a very good school. I got a great education, but it was very rigorous, and it fostered a climate of sexual repression and guilt and shame and all that kind of stuff. And this, is accumulation of 17 plus years as a Catholic kid. And in my senior year, in January 65, I had a nervous breakdown and physical breakdown. I was in really bad shape, and I was put in a mental hospital in Milwaukee, and I spent 4 months there. And it was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. It was a blessing in disguise. I wrote a book about this called The Broken Places, a memoir. What it did was it got me out of the house, it got me out of the school, it got me out of the Catholic Church, although that took a little longer to play out. And I finally met a girl. I was struggling with my youthful sexual drive, which was being stifled by the school and the church. But I was an all-boys school, and I couldn't meet girls. The only women I met during that period were some nuns from another school who were... I was the editor of the school paper, and I remember meeting a nice nun who was the advisor on the school paper of the girls' school, But that was about it. And at the hospital, I met this wonderful young woman who liberated me and freed me as a human being and taught me how to live. I was smart and sophisticated intellectually, but I was hopelessly unsophisticated socially. I had no clue how to behave with people, and she taught me all that. And it was a great romance. I loved her very much, but she was very troubled and very up and down and everything. And so it's kind of a tumultuous relationship, but really important to me. But she killed herself later, and that's what I wrote about. It's kind of like the Star is Born situation that Cukor made the great Star is Born film with Judy Garland, and
Yeah.
one person goes up and the other person goes down, and one person transforms the other into a better person, and rescues this person, but just destroys himself or herself in this case. But anyway, so while I was in this hospital getting better, they let me out for weekend passes, and I would go to movies downtown in Milwaukee. And I was kind of a movie buff all the way through my childhood, went to a lot of movies at our local theater. And my dad worked on the Milwaukee Journal, and he had passes for the downtown theaters. So I would take the bus and go down there and see, films like The Diary of Anne Frank and, important films of that sort. Lawrence of Arabia. Well, I saw that in my local theater, I think. But My Fair Lady was playing at a big Milwaukee theater. Those were the days of the roadshow engagements when they were called hard ticket because you had to buy a ticket in advance like you would for a play. And it was very prestigious, and they had big screens, big theaters, wonderful sound system. And this movie was, wow, glamorous, gorgeous. But I was deeply moved by My Fair Lady because it's the story of somebody transforming somebody else into a better human being. And I identified with Eliza Doolittle. I saw this film 5 times that spring. It kept going back, and it just coincided with me living the same experience, basically. And I identified with Eliza, who was this, what they call in the film, a squash cabbage leaf flower girl, Cockney, who was rescued and taught how to talk good English and have manners. And it was a wonderful satire by George Bernard Shaw, originally Pygmalion. And Cukor's Pygmalion theme runs through a lot of his films, the Pygmalion Galatea legend. And he was a Pygmalion toward many actors and actresses. As a director, that's what they do. They transform people or help them be themselves, actually. It was more to the point, I think. He always said that what a film director does is you help the person be, not act. Being is more important for a film actor than acting in the theatrical sense. And we'll talk about that because that's an important part of what I studied. But so I also identified with Henry Higgins. Rex Harrison was wonderful. He won the Oscar for My Fair Lady. Cukor won his only Oscar for My Fair Lady. Audrey Hepburn was wonderful as Eliza. Controversial choice because Julie Andrews had played the role on stage, but she was passed over because Hepburn was a major movie star. And, Hepburn couldn't sing as well as Julie Andrews, so they dubbed her with Marnie Nixon most of her performance, and that's a problem. But Marnie Nixon has had a lovely voice. And Hepburn, I think, brings a lot of emotional depth to the role that maybe Julie Andrews in her youth might not have brought to it. It's hard to know from this distance, but there's some clips of Julie Andrews you can watch on TV back then doing scenes from the play. And but anyway, it is what it is, a beautifully directed film. And Henry Higgins was a pedant and a very tyrannical guy, and he was a misogynist to some extent, and that's part of the humor of the story. But he in the Cukor version especially, you believe that they start to have a kind of a romantic relationship, a very guarded one, because Higgins is kind of, wary of women, and Cukor has fun. Cukor was a queer filmmaker, and he has kind of fun with the male relationship between Higgins and Colonel Pickering, a fellow philologist who he lives with, and they're 2 old bachelors and having a gay old time in there, and he's relaxed enough as a director that he had some kind of gay jokes in the film. But I kind of identified with Higgins because I was sort of a pedant in those days. And my hobby was etymology. I was writing my first book on, it was on baseball slang. And I started in May of '63 when I was, sophomore in high school. And it took me 3 summers to write a book called High and Inside, The Complete Guide to the Language of Baseball. The Complete Guide to the Language of Baseball. And I couldn't sell it. I didn't know how to sell it. So it sat around for a long time, and I finally published it in 1980. And, I had to rewrite it. And then I rewrote it again in 1986. It's called High and Inside, an A to Z guide to the language of baseball. But I was a baseball fanatic for years. The Milwaukee Braves were my team, and it was a great period. The great Henry Aaron, Warren Spahn, Eddie Matthews. I worked at County Stadium to put myself through this private, expensive high school. I sold hot dogs and Cokes and things. And, I was just obsessed with baseball. And so I kind of wanted to be an insider, and that's what slang does. It's the way of making people insiders. But I was fascinated by language, and I was a big reader. And so I delved into the derivations of baseball, slang and nicknames and stuff, and I taught myself how to write a book just by doing it, and I've been writing books ever since. But anyway, so My Fair Lady was changing my life, and at a really crucial turning point. It also kept me out of the Vietnam War, by the way. When I was in college, I had a student deferment, and I gave it up. I wanted to get the whole thing over with, so I was called up for a physical. I guess it was around 67 or thereabouts, when the war was really heating up. And it was kind of a risky thing to do, but I just wanted to get it over with. And they said, I said to them, I want to see a psychiatrist, and they said, oh, okay. And so I went into a room with the doctor, and he said, what do you want to see me about? And I told him I had this breakdown in high school. And he said, okay. And where was it? And I told him, and I said, gave him the name of a doctor, and he said, okay, see you later. And then a week later, I got my card in the mail, 1Y, saved my life. So
there you go.
The best
breakdowns have their upsides.
That's my philosophy. I was just telling somebody yesterday that my philosophy is if you have something bad happen to you, write a book about it and make something creative out of it,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I could relate because I wasn't in a mental hospital for as long as you, but I had a bit of a break. I don't know if you necessarily call it a breakdown, but I had to see a doctor, and I discovered in the hospital that they diagnosed me with OCD, which people joke about, but can be a very debilitating mental health condition. And looking back on my life, I'm like, oh, this totally makes sense. So, it helps you, once you have that, you're empowered by your problems. I'm sure you would agree. It certainly makes your life a hell of a lot better, or a good book,
OCD and Asperger's syndrome and things like that can actually be good for writers and creative people because, we're all obsessives, and if you write a book, you have to be an obsessive. You have to be into OCD to make sure everything is correct and organized. And so I'm glad you came through that. And but it is helpful to know exactly, what your psyche is all about. And
exactly,
and then you can be more clear about your life. And trauma is kind of a topic that's talked about a lot these days. Everybody has trauma in their background. I mean, even being born as a trauma, you're in this nice warm place and you come out and somebody hits you, And
that's a good point.
It's a rude shock, but Cukor, Dan Callahan wrote a very good essay on Cukor in Senses of Cinema, the Australian film publication, and he wrote that Cukor is fascinated by self-destructive tendencies in people and wildness and dangerous, reckless qualities in characters. And a lot of his characters fit that description. And I was always fascinated by Cukor is really into portraying alcoholics, and he does that so well. There's so many memorable alcoholics in his films. James Mason in A Star Is Born is the best. I mean, great performance, self-destructive movie star. John Barrymore in Dinner at 8, and Lou Ayres in Holiday. Wonderful drunk scene he has with his sister Katherine Hepburn, and I always wondered about that. Why is Cukor so interested? He was not an alcoholic himself. But the more you know about him, Pat McGilligan, my friend, wrote a good biography of him called A Double Life, and Cukor had weight issues. When he was younger, he was kind of heavy, and then he lost weight around the late 30s, and he was kind of slender after that. But he was kind of emotionally volatile. He had outbursts on the set. There's a funny story about Rich and Famous, the last film he directed. Steven Spielberg went to see Cukor shooting outdoors at UCLA. Jacqueline Bisset was giving a speech to a bunch of students, and Cukor was sitting in his directing chair, and like old men do, he would loosen his pants, to relax. And suddenly he jumped up. He got angry about something. He jumped up, and his pants fell down in front of everybody. And so he had his moments. On Little Women, he said he hit Katherine Hepburn because she was wearing a period dress, and she was eating an ice cream cone. He said, "Be very careful. We only have one dress, And she was reckless and spilled the ice cream all over her dress, and so he hit her. He probably didn't do much damage, but I mean, he was kind of volatile. But he was also very charming and all that. But his emotions were on display, and his films are very emotional. And he said, "I leave a lot of myself on the floor when I'm directing a film." In other words, there's a lot of blood on the floor from his own self, personal feelings and thoughts, and that's part of the dilemma for writing a book about Cukor. Is who was he in terms of, was he an auteur, or was he just a very stylish, efficient director? That's what most people thought. Most film fans, as you said, have several Cukor films they could notice. A lot of people don't maybe know his name. I found this to be true. I'd say George Cukor, and they give me that look, which I used to get when I would mention John Ford. Both times I've done books on John Ford, one reason I did them was you'd get this blank look when you'd say the name John Ford, and that was really disconcerting. And he wasn't, well, he was a household name in an earlier period, but Hitchcock and Lubitsch and Capra to some extent were household names, and but Ford's reputation had kind of faded into oblivion, and so I and my friend Mike Wilmington wanted to bring him back to notice, and so we did a book on him in the late 60s, early 70s, and along with other writers on Ford, numerous books have come out. We've kind of restored Ford to public attention. But I when I did my biography of Ford, which took 30 years to do, and it came out in 2001, I wrote it partly because I had the same reaction. People would say, John Ford, who is that guy? And but you don't get that now, but you get it with Cukor, and but then you say, Dinner at 8, Philadelphia Story, Holiday, Gaslight, My Fair Lady, Adam's Rib, Stars Born. People say, "Oh, several of my favorite films there."
Yeah, it's interesting because I know, like I had said before before I read the book, I asked you which films to check out, and on your list, a lot of them I hadn't seen, but I was like, oh wait, I've seen this, and I've seen that. But he's become. I mean, maybe it's still too fresh in my mind to say he's become one of my favorites, but I think he's on the road of becoming that, because there's so many of his films I find I could personally relate to and identify with. And I mean, I'm in show business myself. So many of his movies have characters in show business. I mean, one like Holiday, for example, just everything about individualism there with Grant's character. I mean, I could identify with maybe going against the grain among people I grew up with, and how difficult that is, because people have a hard time doing that. They want to stick with what they know, and the fact that he wanted to strike out on his own and discover life and see what life was about, and how that really inspired Katherine Hepburn, and how they had this rebellious nature. I thought, what an important film to see, because so many people have a hard time doing what they want to do because they're trying to please their, mother or father or what have you. I mean, I just, so wonderful, that movie, I thought.
Yeah, I had a great piece of advice when I was having my trouble in high school. My mother knew a guy who was a New York public relations guy, and he wrote this wonderful 5-page letter to me, which I reproduce in my book, Broken Places. And one thing he said was, I know you're worried about what your parents think of you and you want to be, a good student. And he said, to hell with all that. Just be yourself, do whatever you want to do. And,
Right.
I wasn't quite ready to hear that at the time, but I was kind of getting that. But yeah, Holiday is a marvelously directed film, and if you want to see what good direction is, you buy the Blu-ray of Holiday and watch Cukor's version, then watch the 1930 version that was done, the Coming of Sound, which has a really good actress, Anne Harding, in the role that Hepburn played later, and Hepburn actually understudied Hope Williams in the play. Anne Harding is a kind of a Katherine Hepburnish actress, a very attractive and very smart and sophisticated actress, and she got an Oscar nomination for that part. Some of the supporting cast is not as good, but Mary Astor is terrific in that film. The only flaw, I think, in the Cukor version is that Cary Grant is supposed to marry this rich girl, and they cast Doris Nolan, who's a competent actress, but not very appealing in any way. And she doesn't compare with Hepburn. Grant gradually realizes he's falling in love with her sister, who's much more of a free spirit, Katherine Hepburn,
Yeah.
But Cukor wanted to cast Carol Lombard, and she would have been wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. But
yeah, you mentioned that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, Katherine Hepburn didn't want another woman star to be in the film with her. And, as great as Katherine Hepburn is, she had some insecurities, and actresses and actors all suffer from that. And not everybody, but she probably didn't want another beautiful actress opposite her. But in the 1930 version, it's a real, it's not, I like romantic comedies where both women are really attractive. Like the best romantic comedy, I think, is Trouble in Paradise, the Lubitsch film.
The Lubitsch, yeah.
The two women in that are equally wonderful. Kay Francis and Miriam Hopkins, and Herbert Marshall's in love with both, and you really can't choose between them. You kind of wish you could have both of them be in love with him as they are, and then he has to make a choice that's quite sad at the end. But in the Cukor version, they kind of load the dice by making one sister much more attractive.
That's a good point. I'll have to get the Blu-ray now that there's still some Boxing Day sales floating around until the new year. But you touched on A Star Is Born, and I hadn't seen it before, and also loved it. It was really got to me as well. I mean, it's so emotionally devastating. And I mean, particularly some of those, I know you wrote about this as well, some of those, because as an actor myself, just some of those moments he really and they're small sometimes and short, but they really captured what actors go through. Like when she's first becomes a contract player, and she's doing something where she just has to wave her hand through the window. And when the assistant director or the director came, we don't want to see your face, hide your face. And to think how insensitive that is to tell a woman, just treat her like a prop, and oh my God, as someone who's been in the film and television and theater industry since 2007 now, that happens all the time. Yeah. They really are so insensitive to what even if you're doing something small, they'll treat, we know, what do you, just like that. I mean, I've had that happen many times, we can't see your face here, you're whatever. And they, it could be really humiliating. And even, I know you wrote about this as well, when she goes back, when they're doing that movie, she's doing a film and she gets really upset in her change room, but then she has to go do another take. And she's such a trooper, she's such a troop. And I thought that, of course, we have things bad happen. Things are, bad happen to us. But then you have a big audition or you're doing a play or a rehearsal and you have to go. You have to be a professional. I just thought just that, I was really glad he included that. But that's great film.
Oh, what a great film. That's one of my favorite films ever. To me, it's one of the top 20 films ever made, I would say. But yeah, that scene is sensational. That's the one where Judy Garland is breaking down in her dressing room. And it's a long take in widescreen. Charles Bickford is the studio chief who's sympathetic, is at one far end of the frame and she's at the other. And there's a vast gulf in between them. And it's very expressive and very daring framing. That film is visually stunning, and Cukor, his work becomes more and more visually stunning over time. But that shows what an actor goes through, and in a broader sense, life. I mean, you have terrible things happen to you, but you have to do your job, and life goes on, and that's
the show must go on, right?
yeah. I mean, it really brings it home, and then she has to clean her face and go and put her makeup back on and go off and do this musical number. And but just want to finish my point. By the way, I got a little off track there when I was talking about the 1930 holiday. It's very, very limply directed. It's very poorly staged. It's kind of awkward, like a play on film. And Cukor directed a lot of play adaptations. Most of his films are based on plays, not novels. And yet, as Martin Scorsese pointed out, how did he do it? They don't seem like plays. They seem cinematic. And Cukor said late in life, he said he realized very early in his career, he was a theater director who was brought to Hollywood to be a dialogue director on early talkies. And he worked on All Quiet on the Western Front, a really great film, 1930. Louis Milestone directed that, and Cukor spent 6 months, doing screen tests with these young actors and rehearsing them and working with them. And that's one reason Lou Ayres is so great in that film, and other young actors. It's a marvelous film. But then he had to have they let him start directing, and he had to have a co-director to work with him, help him with the camera and all that. But he said very quickly that cinema is movement. You have to keep things moving, and you kind of have to feel you're in the midst of the action, and the camera has to move around with the actors. And some of a trademark of his throughout his career is a long take, where the camera just watches the actors for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, even 8 minutes in Love Among the Ruins with Katherine Hepburn and Laurence Olivier. And it constantly moves around the actors and reframes it, and it's just marvelously blocked. And but it doesn't, unless you're a cinephile like us and the people who are listening, you wouldn't necessarily notice that there's no cut. The average film goer doesn't notice it. And I asked Cukor, why, what do you like about long takes? I mean, they're virtuosic. I mean, film buffs love them because it's breathtaking how they can pull this off.
Yeah.
But he said it makes it feel more real and less acted, he said, which is an interesting point, less acted. And there's a great story. Jack Lemmon told this on an American Masters broadcast. They did a show on Cukor, and he made his film debut in It Should Happen to You, a romantic comedy with Judy Holliday. And Lemmon had been in many plays and television plays too. And so he was used to projecting to the second balcony and being big, on television in those days. The screen was small, and so the actors, tended to act broadly. And so he was doing that with Cukor, and Cukor kept saying, less, less, less. And he kept making him do it over and over. And Lemmon, who's a very amiable guy, was getting irritated uncharacteristically. And Cukor finally said, okay, could you do it again? And Lemmon said, you're going to tell me less? And Cukor said, yeah. And Lemmon said, are you trying to tell me not to act at all? And Cukor said, oh, yes, dear boy, please, please, please don't act. Wow. And he said, Lemmon said,
I love that story.
Yeah, that was the best advice he got. He said it made his whole career as a motion picture actor that, don't act. And when I was acting for Orson Welles, one of the reasons I was able to do this book on Cukor's actors was I spent 5 years acting for Orson Welles, another great actors director. I think the greatest actors directors in the cinema are Cukor, Welles, Ingmar Bergman, Elia Kazan, and I would say Max Ophuls and Jean Renoir. All those guys are tremendous. But I spent 5 years working for Wells. I was not an actor. He put me on the other side of the wind, his roman à clef about Hollywood, because he loved the mixture of, very talented, very experienced actors and some newcomers, and then some non-actors. He liked to play around with non-actors too, and he put me in there playing a kind of a funny version of myself, kind of a slightly exaggerated version of an earnest young film critic, following John Huston around, asking him silly film buff questions. I was supposed to be writing a book on this old director, and Wells let me write the questions with him. Most of my lines were, pestering Huston's character with questions. So I would, give out questions, and Wells would take some and reject others, and then he'd write it out, and he would adapt them, and then he'd give me the piece of paper, and I would have to deliver them verbatim. I couldn't deviate a bit, and his blocking was fantastic. I mean, he was a great theater director too, and so the movements were very choreographed, and I couldn't deviate from them, and I couldn't add anything. And Keith Baxter, who I got to know, who's wonderful in Chimes of Midnight playing Prince Hal, he said most directors, they either move the camera or move the actors, but he said Wells does both at the same time all the time,
Right.
And it's really tricky to act for him. But I spent 5 years, and after a while, I kind of, started to learn a few things about acting, and it was a great experience. But he would say to me often, don't act, when I was trying to add something, because if you're not a trained actor and you try to add some bit of business, it's bad, because you don't have the skills, So he just wanted me to be myself, whatever that is. But you have to kind of create what Cukor called a climate to relax people so they can just enjoy being in the scene and not be self-conscious. And I was very pleased to read that when he directed Tim Holt in The Magnificent Ambersons, who's so good in that film, he would tell him don't act often too. And Tim Holt was an experienced, good actor, but Wells wanted a certain kind of relaxed naturalism from Tim Holt, and he got it from him by telling him don't act. And that's what Cukor told Jack Lemmon. And in various ways, he encouraged people just to be themselves. But, it is tricky to be yourself in a film. I asked John Wayne about this. In my introduction, I have a lot of thoughts about acting in cinema, because I think it's a very misunderstood subject. People tend to think, they give awards like Oscars and Emmys, especially, to what I call the most acting. People who scream and cry and wave their arms and put on makeup and costumes and accents and very showy acting. But the best actors, like, say, Cary Grant and John Wayne, almost never got Oscars until they were old, and they would give them a special Oscar usually. And people put down actors they'd say, well, he's just playing himself. But that's what stars do. That's why we go to see a movie star, because we like that person's persona. We like the way the person behaves and talks and walks and looks, and they're expressive. They have expressive features, and I asked John Wayne, who gets put down a lot for, he's just being himself, but he's my favorite movie actor. And I was on the set of The Shootist, his final film. He gives a great performance. And I said, what do you think when you hear people saying that? And he said, well, it's quite obvious it can't be done, because he said, if you just play yourself in a movie, you'd be the dullest son of a bitch who ever walked across the screen. He said, what you have to do is project yourself. You have to project a personality, which I think was very shrewd. And then he said, I have only one trick. I pause in the middle of a sentence so you don't look away. And then I don't pause at the end of a sentence so you don't look away. And I think I thought a lot about Wayne's acting, and I've written about it. That pause in the middle of a sentence actually gives him a certain vulnerability. It reminds me of Hemingway's characters. Hemingway, who people think just was this macho blowhard and all that. I mean, he created his work was often about male sensitivity and male trauma and fragility of the male psyche. And John Wayne's character is so strong on the screen. Howard Hawks told me, he said, John Wayne is so strong, he blows everybody else off the screen. You have to have a really strong actor to stand up to him, like Robert Mitchum, for example, you know. But the pausing in the middle of the line makes Wayne seem a little hesitant and vulnerable, and it's an effective counteraction to the strength. And he also, I said, do you like to make fun of yourself in a movie too? And he said, oh my God, yes. He said, that's one of the most important things about being big, you know, and
Right.
he's kind of likes Ford and other Hawks who kind of play around with his persona. But, you know, what Wayne did was he created a persona all through the 30s until John Ford was willing to put him in a starring role in Stagecoach. Wayne created that walk and that talk and the costume and mannerisms and all these things that we're used to and we like. But it took a long time for him to assemble all those parts. And he had Paul Fix, a veteran actor, helped him learn how to walk and talk and things like that. But so film acting is a complicated thing. And George Cukor, according to Charles Brackett, who was a great screenwriter, worked with Billy Wilder a lot, and he said George Cukor invented the art of dialogue in films. He taught us how people should talk on the screen. You know, in the early 30s, there was a lot of stiff acting. People didn't know how to behave on the screen and talk. Hawks told me, he said the acting in a lot of early talkies was like a villain talking on a southern riverboat, you know, and, you know, very hokey and hammy. And
Yeah.
Cukor came out, and if you look at Lou Ayres and All Quiet on the Western Front and other people in Cukor's early films, such as Frederick March and The Royal Family of Broadway, and Lowell Sherman in What Price Hollywood, the first iteration of A Star Is Born. They're very natural, very relaxed, and yet they're bigger than life too. They're kind of theatrical people. As you said, as an actor, you relate to a lot of his characters because a lot of his people are performers, and if they're not movie actors or stage actors or singers, they're sometimes like lawyers. For example, Katherine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy is a pair of married lawyers in Adam's Rib, and lawyers are actors. And you know, that film is a very witty Ruth Gordon Garson Kanin script about battle of the sexes in a courtroom. It's Hepburn is a feminist lawyer, and her husband is defending prosecuting a woman who shot her philandering husband. And so it has a lot of feminist issues. And it's two people performative behavior. One thing we talk about a lot today is that gender is performative. It's not necessarily something you're born with. It's something you learn from the society you live in teaches you what a man is supposed to be or what a woman's supposed to be or whatever. And then there's this whole concept of gender fluidity where people are fascinated by. And Cukor was into all that long ago. That's the essence of his art, was examining those things in actors and actresses.
Yeah, that of course he explored explicitly in Sylvia Scarlett, which is way ahead of his ahead of his time. I think even now that would stir some controversy, but also be embraced much more, you know, from certain circles, more progressive circles nowadays. But one thing that I was really fascinated by how you wrote about the way in which he worked with actors, and as you said, creating the climate, and obviously having those long takes and having the actors be able to really interact with one another, play the scene out. Obviously, that helps actors a lot. But I was curious because, you know, one thing that was always instilled in me was because I studied the teachings of Sanford Meisner, who was part of the group theater. And, you know, he always instilled in his students acting is the reality of doing, so you got to know what the objective is and try to get that from the other person. So I was curious, do you happen to know if that was something he discussed in rehearsals or on set? What do you want the other person to do in this scene? Was that something that he kind of really stressed, or I don't know if you would happen to know, but.
Yeah, just to mention something about the group theater, Elia Kazan came out of the group theater, and there's a very good interview book with Kazan by Jeff Young. It's mostly about acting, and Kazan gives some great advice, and I tell my screenwriting students this: give the actors something to do in the scene with their hands, or just some physical task. He said, for example, have the actor making bread, or lifting something, or doing this and this and this. In other words, what's the worst kind of acting and composition? You're at a Christmas party with your family, and somebody says, everybody line up against the wall so Uncle Bob can take a picture of us, or whatever. That's and you see some of the early talkies, and that's kind of what the compositions were like. But a good director has depth in the compositions and movement, and it's meaningful movement to it. But when you give people things to do, one thing Kazan said about that, it makes the actor unself-conscious. They stop they stop thinking about how am I coming across. They're just thinking about what is the scene, what am I saying to this person, and also listening. Gene Simmons, who starred in The Actress, a wonderful Cukor film.
That was my favorite out of all the ones I saw. That who do we have to contact to get a Blu-ray of that? Because I know it's not very well known by the looks of it, I think. But oh my God, I loved that. It's probably maybe not considered his best film, but it was personally for me. I just adored it. And Tracy is, remarkable. What a performance by Spencer.
I was going to ask you which ones you found, and I'm glad that one came up. It's not very well known. It is Tracy is astonishing in that film. One of the great performances ever. And I wasn't quite prepared for that when I saw this film. I'd seen that film when I did this book. I saw all the Cukor films over and over, and I had seen The Actress long ago, and I didn't remember it too well, but I started watching it, and it's Ruth Gordon's autobiographical play about how she became an actor. And she was this kind of homely young woman living in a lower middle class family in Massachusetts. And she had a father who was a retired sea captain who was working in this kind of mundane job in a food factory. And she had this daring idea to go to New York and become an actress. And Cukor said, I'm just lost in admiration for people who just go to LA or New York and just try their hand and try to become an actor. But somebody who wasn't glamorous like her, it was very daring and very wonderful that she succeeded, and she became a great screenwriter too. And I didn't
know that until I read the book. I was like, oh my God. I know her, of course, from movies like Rosemary's Baby and Harold and Maude, but I didn't know she was. I'll have to read her book because it looks pretty fascinating.
Yeah, she wrote a couple books. Well, she wrote this play. It's called Years Ago, and you could find used copies of it. They did it on Broadway with Frederick March playing the father. And so Tracy played the part in the film, and Ruth Gordon wrote a couple of memoirs too. But she became a movie star in her old age, which was fascinating. She started in movies in like 1914 or something, had some small parts. She was in, say, Abe Lincoln in Illinois, and she has bit parts in Cukor's the last film that Greta Garbo did. I'm blanking on the title. But she didn't have a great film career until she was old, and Rosemary's Baby is what did it for her. And she won an Oscar. There's a wonderful clip I would recommend people look at YouTube, because Ruth Gordon getting her Oscar for Rosemary's Baby, she goes up there with the Beethoven music playing, and she looks at the Oscar and she says, "I can't tell you how encouraging a thing like this is." And she brought down the house because she was, 70 years old or whatever. And she
quite a story.
she became this funny movie star, and the young audience at the time thought she was cool. She did
Yeah.
Where's Papa, and Harold and
Mm.
Maude was this wonderful cult favorite, and
Yeah.
but she was a zany, interesting lady, but she wrote this play, but it was mostly about her father, and he was this fascinating character. And at first, as Cukor wrote in a letter that I quote to Gordon and Kanan, at first the audience thinks it's kind of a heartwarming family story, and this curmudgeonly old father and this girl wants to go to New York, and then they suddenly realize that this guy has a lot more depth, and there's this fantastic long take that he sits down at the part of what Cukor was really into is research, and they went to Ruth Gordon's house where she grew up, and it was this very kind of smallish house, kind of maze-like, with a lot of funny kind of architecture that you wouldn't invent unless you could see the real thing. And so they imitated that on the stage at MGM. And so he's angry, and he's a frustrated guy, and he's upset about how he's not listened to by his daughter. She's a rebellious kid, teenager, Gene Simmons. Anyway, he sits at the kitchen table, and his wife and daughter are kind of nervously milling around with him. And he's making a sandwich while he's talking, and he starts eating this sandwich. And at one point, he leaves the frame, and he goes off into a side room. He's making the sandwich, and the camera doesn't follow him in there. It just kind of stays in the kitchen, and then he comes back in. It's a daring kind of cinematic thing, but it's something like a 3.5 minute take, and the camera's moving in, but he gets very emotional, and he starts revealing things about himself that his wife and daughter didn't know about, how he had been abused as a child, and he was orphaned, and his mother committed suicide, and he went to sea. He escaped his abusive step-parents and went to sea, and he gets deeply angry and anguished, and all the time he's eating this sandwich. It's amazing acting. Richard Burton happened to be on the set, and I found this out from reading a very good biography of Tracy by James Curtis. So Richard Burton was on the Dick Cavett show, and I found it. And he was in Hollywood at the time, and he wanted to watch Tracy work. All the actors loved Tracy, And my dad, Ray McBride, of the Milwaukee Journal, interviewed Tracy a long time ago. My dad was the film and TV and radio editor, and he interviewed stars when they came to Milwaukee. And when he was interviewing, he didn't interview Tracy. He interviewed Cary Grant. That's right, Cary Grant. He said to Cary Grant, "Which actor do you like the most?" He said, "Well, we all like Spencer Tracy the most." And he said, "Why?" And Grant picked up a glass of water, and he started drinking it while he was talking. And he demonstrated, he said, it's really hard to drink a glass of water while you're talking to somebody and make it natural. And he said, Tracy does that better than any of us.
Yeah.
And we all learn from this guy. So that's kind of what he's doing, but even in a more complicated way. But so Burton was on the Dick Cavett show describing this, and he said he had his own idea about how this scene should be played because he had read the script. He thought it was a really good monologue. But he said Tracy did it totally different from what he expected. And he said it was just devastating. He said, especially when he left the set for a while and they came back and he was still eating and talking. And at one point, the daughter's hand reaches into the frame and puts her hand on his hand because she suddenly feels compassion for her father. She's a very self-centered girl, and like a lot of teenagers are, and she suddenly starts understanding her father. And what's remarkable is it's not a cliched character. What you expect from that period is the father would be, condemning her for being an actress. That's
where I thought I thought it was going to go. I thought it was going to be like that's one of those stories in Dead Poets Society where that one young guy commits suicide because his father was set against him being an actor. And I was so shocked that when he finds out about it, even though he was not crazy about it. He was intrigued, because he had his experience. He had seen theater and he had experience working in a theater. And I thought, wow, who does totally, it just goes to show, like in life, when you think you know someone, we're all made up of so many parts, right? You can never truly, know anyone.
I was thinking when I did my Capra biography, I spent 7 years on that. And I thought, at some point, I know him a lot better than I know my own father. And I thought that was it's kind of sad because,
well, that's true. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time talking to Capra and meeting people who knew him and looking for documents and stuff, but I didn't do that with my own dad. We don't do that with our parents, and so we don't really know them. We don't know much about what they were before we came along, and that's part of what this play is about. And so for this guy to suddenly reveal to his wife and daughter all this history is fascinating. And then he reveals that he was fascinated by the theater, as you say, and he was a stagehand, so he could watch the great actors and got to know them. And that's why he suddenly, he's sympathetic to the girl wanting to become an actor. And Katherine Hepburn, when she told her father she wanted to be an actress, he hit her in the face. They were sitting in the car. Slaps
you mentioned that.
Wow. I mean, he was this tyrannical surgeon, and she was dedicated to her family, but I mean, they sound like kind of really controlling people. But this guy in this film, there's a wonderful close-up of Tracy reacting to his daughter with a very empathetic but puzzled look. And Cukor said to him afterwards, "That was wonderful. What was that?" And he said, "Oh, I was remembering when I told my father I was going to become an actor, and my father said, I was thinking, oh, you poor skinny kid with the big ears, life is going to really, wallop you over the head, And he remembered his dad, and it really brought back this thing. But Tracy was not an actor who liked to talk about what he was going to do ahead of time. Cukor loved having long talks with actors, but he modified that with Tracy. One of the things that makes a good actors director in film, which I learned, is you don't treat everybody the same way. Everybody is unique, and everybody has ways that they need to be treated. And Tracy was not one who liked long talks, whereas Katherine Hepburn loved long explorations of everything, And then some other actors, Ingrid Bergman, Cukor directed her to an Oscar in Gaslight, but he would tell her the plot up to the point of the scene they were going to do, to get her in the right mood. Because part of what a director does, and Cukor excels at this too, is keep the right tone going. Because only the director knows how to control the tone, because films often are shot out of sequence.
Yeah.
And he has a tremendous control of tone, like going from drama to some light comedy to maybe farce, sudden tragedy, drama, comedy. I mean, he controls it like a maestro. But Ingrid Bergman said at one point, I'm not stupid. You don't have to keep telling me the story of the movie. And he got kind of intimidated. But then he noticed after a couple days he wasn't talking to her much and her performance suffered. So he thought, what the hell? I'll just go back and do what I always do. And then it worked out fine. Gene Kelly didn't like Cukor chattering away, but he was a very talkative fellow. And but I'll just give one example about good acting and bad acting. I interviewed Hank Worden, the old guy who plays Old Mose in The Searchers. He's so wonderful, a Western character actor. And he's in a lot of John Ford films. Wonderful man. And he was in The Alamo, too, which was directed by John Wayne. Right. So I said to him, what's the difference between John Ford and John Wayne as directors? And I don't think anybody had ever asked him before. And he said, well, Wayne was used to being yelled at by Ford. Ford bullied Wayne, but Wayne was, Wayne knew that Ford was a great director, and so he put up with it. But also, he learned a lot from Ford. He was smart enough to listen, But Claire Trevor told me when they did Stagecoach, Ford was rough on Wayne. He would grab him by the chin and he'd say, stop moving your chin so much. You don't act with your chin, you act with your eyes. He always said, look at the eyes. That's where acting is, and stop moving around so much, et cetera. And so he said Wayne thought the way to direct actors was to yell at everybody. indiscriminately. And so he said he yelled at me, and he said, I'm a sensitive kind of guy, and if somebody yells at me, I freeze up and I get self-conscious, and I don't think I'm very good in the Alamo because of that. But he said Ford, like in The Horse Soldiers, which was made around the same time, right before the Alamo, he said Ford treated him like a baby, you know, very gently and very soft and funny and kind. And, Ford could vary his approach, and Cukor did that kind of thing too. He generally was pretty easygoing and gentle, but he could be harsh, as he said, or sometimes even he wrote a piece on directing in the 30s, and he talked about Hepburn, that he said he sometimes would put on a kind of a false bullying tone because she could be kind of a bully. So he had to kind of fight with her on the set a little bit, but within limits. And but he was a master psychologist, and that's what makes a good director.
There was that one line that really hit home for me, which I think is where Tracy, as character, he gives his daughter something to sell to help her when she goes to to New York, which meant a lot to her and to him. And she's when she's like, I can't sell this, and then he was like, hey, if you want to be an actress, you're going to be in and out of the pawn shop your whole life.
Yeah.
I guess, which is the equivalent. I mean, I know pawn shops still exist, but today it's like Facebook Marketplace, which I use sometimes to sell stuff. You get some extra cash. And I just thought, wow, I mean, Ruth Gordon really knew what she was talking about.
Yeah, at one point, one of my low points in Hollywood, when I was struggling, I very melodramatically thought of the scene in Last Weekend, the Billy Wilder film, where Ray Milland he wants to pawn his typewriter so he can get a drink,
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought, I'm going to go pawn my typewriter. I was feeling sorry for myself. And I took it to a pawn shop, and the guy said, well, we can let you have $15. And I thought, $15? It's not going to
God.
get me. Forget about it. Yeah. But in the Cukor film, it's this wonderful telescope that symbolizes his whole.
That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. Going to sea, and there's a scene where he's polishing it, and he takes great care of it. But he gives it to her, and it's a very touching symbol. And he doesn't say go to a pawn shop. He says, there's a guy, he's a sea captain, and here's his name, and he writes it down. He says, go to him and he'll give you $100 for it if you really need money,
Right.
And
right. That's right.
Yeah. And so he's very generous toward his daughter. So as Cukor said, the audience really suddenly realizes this man is a fascinating character. He's not.
Absolutely.
Not what we expected. And that's part of what's great in Cukor films. People are not stereotyped, and they're not, conventional anything. They're not conventional villains, he excels in non-conventional relationships of all kinds, sexually and otherwise, friendships and marriages and, romantic things. And, he is a very subversive director in a very subtle way, and people have to really kind of look at his films carefully. I'm glad you liked Sylvia Scarlett. Had you seen that before?
I saw it. Yeah, I saw it last year because someone, another writer I had on, he wrote a book about movies. It wasn't necessarily about movies, but there was a lot of things about movie stars that the LGBTQ community has always embraced, and so many movie stars, Marilyn Monroe and Joan Crawford and so many people over the year. And one of them was Katherine Hepburn, and he talked about that film. I thought, I should go see that. And I was like, oh my God, this is 1933.
Yeah. It is mind blowing. That film. It's so wonderful. I have a friend who just saw the film she's reading my book, and what you really hope is exactly what you're telling me, and what she told me is you read a book and it makes you want to see the movies. And so she saw Sylvia Scarlett 2 days ago, and it kind of knocked her out. It's great. Sylvia, Sylvia is this French girl who her father is a criminal, and they have to escape from France to England. And she cuts her hair off and masquerades as a boy. And
Yeah.
Hepburn is a really good-looking young boy, very handsome, and she does a wonderful job of playing that. She was. It's very personal, and Cukor really knew people. He knew Hepburn better than anybody else because he directed her 10 times, and he put her in her first film. But when she was a young woman, a young girl, she said, "I lived as a boy." She created a persona for herself called Jimmy. And she wore pants throughout her life. That was kind of controversial in those days. Women in the 30s, Dietrich and Hepburn wore pants, and that made people angry. There's a great story about Hepburn at RKO in the 30s. Somebody complained that she was wearing pants on the set, so she just stood up and pulled off her pants, and she spent the rest of the day walking around her underpants.
Good for her.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, but so she dresses as a boy in these stylish outfits, and both men and women start hitting on her, which is very funny. It's kind of there is a long theatrical tradition of women wearing pants. It's called Hosenrollen, pants rolls. And Shakespeare's As You Like It. In Shakespeare's day, they wouldn't let women be on the stage, so men played women, and Shakespeare had a lot of comedy about gender fluidity, and Hepburn was very into Shakespeare, and but anyway, and then she starts getting a crush on a handsome guy who's a bohemian artist played by Brian Aherne, who seems a little bi. He's a ladies' man, but he has kind of a effete quality, partly because he's an artist and sophisticated and all that. And he's got a Russian girlfriend who starts putting the make on Hepburn, and there's this wonderful actress named Natalie Paley. And Cukor had such fascinating friends. Natalie Paley was an actual Russian princess. She was one of the Romanov family, and she was a cousin to the Tsar who was executed, and one of her brothers helped kill Rasputin. I mean, my God. And she went to France, and she was a model, and Cukor helped her become an actress, and she's terrific in the film. But Hepburn has this crush on this handsome fellow, so she starts dressing as a girl again. And what's wonderful is that she's very awkward as a girl. She doesn't quite know how to pull it off, and it's very funny and very cute. So Cukor and Hepburn are just having a field day with playing with gender roles and how people are supposed to behave, and she doesn't quite know what she is, and she's exploring it. And there's Hepburn's wrote in her diary during the shooting, "I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and I hope that George knows what we're doing." But in a way, that's good, because she was in the midst of this situation just like the character was, and Cukor was guiding her. It's a very well crafted, exquisitely modulated film with a lot of ups and downs and highs and lows and farce and tragedy and all that kind of stuff. It works really well, and it's just a revelation. And it was a notorious bomb at the time. If you read some of the reviews, people would make remarks that seemed like coded homophobia. This is a queer kind of film. Queer in those days was an insult, and the audience just didn't know what to make of it. And so Cukor and Hepburn told Pandora Berman, the producer, had a production at RKO, "Gee, we'll do another film for you for nothing. We're sorry," and he said, "I never want to see either one of you again." He actually meant that.
Yeah. My God.
But it became a cult favorite over the years. And then with the women's movement in the 60s and gay liberation, people started discovering this film, and it's a classic now,
Yeah, no, I love it. If people haven't seen it, they should definitely go and check it out, because it's great film. I know you got that picture of Truffaut and Cukor and yourself behind you, which is such a great shot. And you said something that Truffaut said that I thought was interesting, where he said, he loved Cukor films, but he's perhaps not someone you write about. He's more someone you talk to a friend about in a cafe. You talk about his movies that way, as opposed to writing them. And I couldn't help but wonder. I couldn't help but wonder why he felt that way. And I mean, obviously Cukor's films are really about human relationships and people and the complexity of human relationships. And it seems like what you did was the best way to go about it. Talk about the acting, talk about the characters, and the connection with Cukor's directing of actors. I couldn't help but wonder, do perhaps people have a harder time generally talking about people, or has critics struggled with that? I wonder.
Well, yeah, as I've been observing, film acting is a misunderstood art by so many people, even film reviewers, who should know better. Make some really bizarre comments about film acting sometimes, but
that's true.
I understand Truffaut's attitude. Now, this picture, by the way, in the background there's Cukor and there's Truffaut, and I'm on the right eavesdropping. And Todd McCarthy, my friend Todd McCarthy, he and I interviewed Cukor in 1981, a long interview for Film Comment about his late films. It was really a wonderful interview. And Todd is still an important film reviewer, and he's in the background there in the maroon outfit. This was the American Film Institute preview party for The Story of Adele H., the Truffaut film in 1975.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And Cukor came and other directors, Sam Fuller. It was really a great evening. But Truffaut was somebody I knew. When he came to Hollywood, every year he would come a couple times, and it was a vacation for him. He would sit by the pool of the Beverly Hills Hotel and smoke cigars and read film books. And then he'd go see Renoir and Hitchcock, and he'd hang out with a few friends. So I got to know him quite well, and he was somebody I greatly admired as a director, but also as a critic. And I felt the same way that he did about Cukor, in a sense that it's very hard to write about this guy. And the first time I tried was 1971. I reviewed another book on Cukor for Film Quarterly. And I said, how do you convey the moment by moment work that he does with, say, Judy Garland in A Star Is Born, this wonderful performance, so many highs and lows. And how do you isolate the moments, and how do you describe, how does he bring these out of her? How does he work with her? And back then we didn't have the ability, at least easily, to do frame enlargements, which now we can do pretty easily. And I spent a lot of time in this book, George Cukor's People, working with photos. And I hired a very good photo technician who I've worked with before. And we did frame enlargements from a lot of the films. And, as you were saying, I approached Cukor through the actors, and I wrote 65 or so portraits of performances by various people in his films, stars and also character actors who are wonderful. So I picked frame enlargements from key scenes that I wrote about that illustrated body language and behavior, and I've been a screenwriter. Part of my preparation for this book was 18 years as a screenwriter. And one of the important things is body language. Behavior is a big part of how you create character in a film, not just dialogue.
Right.
But also the direction of dialogue is very important, the vocal qualities of performances. But and I had also picked some terrific pictures of Cukor working with various actors. But I lacked the vocabulary back in 1971 to write about acting. I didn't quite know how to do it. And I tried again in 1973. I wrote a piece for Film Comment about What Price Hollywood, which is Cukor's 1932 film that, as I mentioned, is the first version of what became the Star Is Born cycle. And it was produced by David O. Selznick, who made the 1937 Star Is Born. And it was, in that version, Lowell Sherman, who was an actor-director, played this alcoholic director who discovers a waitress and makes her into a star. And he goes downhill and he winds up killing himself. And Constance Bennett plays the actress, and it's good, but it's not as good as Cukor's 54 version, in which the couple are romantically involved. It makes it much more emotionally compelling. In the 1932 version, he's just her mentor, and also he kind of disappears from the film for certain stretches. But Lowell Sherman gave a really remarkably authentic performance as a director because he was a director. And I started getting into his work in Madison, where I went to school. We had the United Artists collection, which had the RKO and Warner Brothers 16 millimeter prints. And so Sherman worked a lot for RKO. He was the guy in Griffith's Way Down East who seduces Lillian Gish, for example, in 1920. He often played a cad or a lecher or an alcoholic, and he was a very sophisticated and somewhat slightly sinister, but very droll kind of guy. So I started watching the films he directed, and they were pretty interesting, and I write about them in this book. But they got much better after he worked with Cukor. He directed some excellent films. He directed Morning Glory with Katherine Hepburn, which won her first Oscar, which was 1933. And that was her third film. Cukor put her in her first film, Bill of Divorcement. But she won an Oscar under Sherman's very, sensitive direction. And he directed Mae West in a really good film. She Done Him Wrong.
Oh, with Grant, yeah.
Yeah, with Cary Grant. And he was directing Becky Sharp with Miriam Hopkins when he died of a heart attack. And it was reshot by Ruben Mamoulian. So he died young, but he was a talented guy but I think he got tired of acting and he got more interested in directing. And so if he had gone on, he would have kept making really good films. But so when he plays a director on the set, it is completely believable. There's a wonderful scene where he's taking this young waitress who can't act and kind of trying to make her give a performance, and he kind of gives up on her because she's hopeless. But then Cukor shows her at home practicing the scene over and over and over again on a staircase, and he does that in A Star Is Born too. There's a lot of attention to hard work. Acting is hard work and preparation. Like he said with Tracy, he said he didn't like to talk about it on the set, but he said, at home the night before, Tracy would be running his lines often with Hepburn, and did a lot of preparation, but he just didn't want to verbalize it. But so then Cukor shows Constance Bennett doing a scene and she's very good. She does a scene. She does it really well after she learns to act, and it's very believable. And a lot of films about filmmaking are not very believable, although Truffaut made one of the best, Day for Night, which all directors love.
Yeah, masterpiece.
Cukor and everybody loved that film, and he made that right before this encounter here. But so I had kind of gotten the hang of writing about this a bit from the Lowell Sherman thing, but I wrote a long essay about Cukor's career much later in the 90s, and I still didn't quite have a handle on, well, gee, who is this guy? I mean, he directed all these plays, and two things distinguished him from a lot of other directors. One was he worked through the actors. He said, primarily, I worked through the actors. I put them forward, and I submerged my personality behind them. And so he was kind of self-effacing, and I'll explain why. But he also had great respect for the text, as he called it. And I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America, and we gave an award late in Cukor's life to Cukor for his respect for writers. And as far as I know, this is unique. Can you imagine the Writers Guild giving a director an award? I mean, directors are usually the enemy. But I was there that night, and he was so thrilled, and everybody was so delighted because he had spent his whole career, he often got the best properties, and then he would hire terrific screenwriters and work with them. Donald Ogden Stewart and Anita Loos, Jane Murfin, Gordon and Kane, and people like that. And Hepburn mentioned that Little Women, which is another wonderful Cukor film.
Oh, yeah.
One of her favorites and one of his favorites. Sarah Mason and Victor Heerman wrote that. They were a married couple. They won the Oscar for the screenplay. And she said she wouldn't commit to that film until they had a good script. And she said they went through several screenwriters, and she said the scripts were actually bad. They didn't get how to adapt the Louisa May Alcott book. But finally, this couple came up with a wonderful script. And Cukor said when he read Little Women, he thought, well, this is just a book for little girls at first. But then he said, I was really stunned by this book. He said, it's a very, realistic and flinty portrait of New England, austerity and family relations. And it's a terrific book, and a very personal book by Alcott. And so he cared deeply about the text, and he wouldn't deviate from it much. Tracy was able to kind of, make lines his own, as a lot of directors do. Actors do. He would add a word here or change it around. If you look at, say, Adam's Rib, the script was published, and you can look at the film, and you can see the little differences, but they're subtle. But if Cukor needed some more lines, he actually would call Gordon and Kanan back at their home in Connecticut and say, could you guys write me 4 lines here in this scene or whatever? And they'd call back half an hour later and then deliver the lines. And most directors would just sort of wing it or throw out, ad libs or whatever. And you could kind of tell. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But Cukor really respected the writers, just like Lubitsch did. And, but anyway, so I finally thought, well, let's just focus on the acting in the films and figure out a way to talk about it. And I think that's what stymied Truffaut. He was a very young critic at the time, 1953, 54, when he wrote that, how do you write about Cukor? He said he's a wonderful director who out of every 5 films makes 1 masterpiece, 3 very good films, and one interesting film, is the way he put it. I think he wrote that in 1950. But he was very young, and he helped create the what we now think is the auteur theory. Although, in a very important distinction, I write about this in my introduction, because how do we figure out who is George Cukor? Ingmar Bergman said a great director has a personal vision. And what is Cukor's personal vision? At first it's hard to discern. There's such a range of kinds of films that he did, and all these famous playwrights and actors, and where is the director and all this? And he's self-effacing, partly because he was a modest man as an artist. And Pierre Renoir's father said an artist must be a craftsman, otherwise he's sunk. If he starts running around saying I'm an artist, he's finished. He should be just a humble craftsman making an object, like a chair or table, whatever. But Cukor, also being gay, had to be discreet, and the word discreet was something he used a lot about his personal life and also about his art, and it became a lifelong way of living. That he was cautious to some. After Sylvia Scarlett, he and Hepburn had to kind of pull back to some extent and not be quite as overt about their sexual experimentation on screen, because they got some pushback. And he also had a character in Our Betters, 1933, a very flaming gay guy in the film, very, very funny at the end of the film. And this guy is really over the top, and he got some real flack from the censors on that one. So he had to be more subtle. So subtle discretion, became his watchword. But subtlety is good for a director. He wasn't blatant about anything. But Truffaut and his colleagues, Romer and Chabrol and Godard, devised what they called the politique des auteurs, which means the policy of authors. It's not the same as the auteur theory. The policy of authors meant that they had certain directors that they admired, and they would tend to write about them favorably. And they kind of felt that, if Renoir made a film, even if it wasn't one of his best, it was worth studying. Whereas other directors who weren't authors, didn't have a distinctive vision, made a film that wasn't worth bothering with, basically. That's a little reductive, but and so they were deciding which directors were worth studying. Andre Bazin, who was kind of their older mentor, thought this was a little simplistic, and he argued with them, but they helped discover value in directors who didn't write their own scripts, such as Raoul Walsh, for example, or Cukor. And they thought also that Hawks and Hitchcock were in that category, although actually Hawks and Hitchcock did have a lot to do with the writing of their scripts. But what is directing? It's not exactly the same as writing, but there's also a French theory called the camera stylo. Alexandre Astruc wrote about this, the camera pen. In other words, you write with camera. And a lot of critics don't understand visual storytelling. All they do is they write about films as if they're literary works, and they listen to the dialogue and they write about the stories, and they don't notice what's being done with the camera. And sometimes they really don't understand a film because, you know, when you study a film over and over again, you see so much is being conveyed with the compositions and the facial expressions and all that. And so when this politique was imported to America by Andrew Sarris in the late 60s or early 60s, he called it the auteur theory, and he codified it in his book, The American Cinema, which is kind of the Bible for my generation of American cinephiles. And he had Pantheon directors and Less Than Meets the Eye and Far Side of Paradise, etc. And some of the so-called Far Side of Paradise or Less Than Meets the Eye directors are actually really terrific directors. And he kind of changed his view on some of them, like Billy Wilder, he underrated, and he elevated him later. And Cukor, he thought, he had trouble understanding Cukor's personality, but he didn't say anything bad about him, because he's a terrific director. But the problem with the auteur theory in America is that it's misunderstood by most people as you have to write and direct your picture to be an auteur. Woody Allen, Orson Welles, Paul Mazursky, the good writer directors. And at the school that I was teaching in until just recently, San Francisco State, we unfortunately teach student filmmakers to do that. It's kind of like assumed you have to write the script of your film that you're directing. And not everybody can write a script. Not everybody can direct. And I always tell people, if you're a student director, look around for good student writers and maybe have a collaboration with them. We don't foster that as much as we should.
Good point.
But there's this theory that you have to write your own thing, but I mean, not really. Cukor has a personality, but you have to kind of really study the films that it doesn't jump out at you. But there's some obvious things like the Pygmalion theme. There are many mentor relationships in his films of somebody helping somebody along and transforming them. Like My Fair Lady is the epitome of that. But it came late in his career, and ironically, a lot of film reviewers and historians kind of like to look down on My Fair Lady, which I think is a terrific film. And I wrote a lot.
I thought so too. I just saw it for the first time the other night. I loved it. I mean, I'd seen the musical years ago, and I knew a lot of the songs, but I was, I can understand why people thought that because it was such a well-known musical, but they overlook it, unfortunately, just because it was a well-known musical, which doesn't mean he's just filming it like a film play. I mean, he has to adapt it, right? And but I thought it was great. I thought it was it's particularly the ending, the ambiguity of like what is this relationship. Is it a romance? Is it not? How you don't really know exactly how they feel about one another, and I was so surprised. I thought he was going to say "I love you" or something when she comes back at the end, and when he just says "Where are my slippers?" It's like they're in for a rough future, or not, or is he joking or what? Right? So I thought, and I agree with you. The acting, but I know Hepburn is perhaps not so convincing when she has got the thick Cockney accent because she's Audrey Hepburn, right? It's how could you? But I thought she still did quite well, and then of course once she's transformed, it's seamless. I mean, I agree. Like the depth she brought to it was stunning, and her and Rex Harrison was wonderful, and it's a great film. I was surprised how much I liked it. I thought it was wonderful.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, it means a lot when you first encounter a film, what's your authentic reaction to it, and not what you're supposed to. Like Hemingway said about writing, it's the process of understanding what you really felt when something was happening rather than what you were supposed to feel.
Right.
That is kind of a watchword for me with film criticism too. But for example, Rex Harrison had played the role many, many times and on stage, and it is not an easy thing to translate a stage performance to a film because people get stale or they get locked into a certain pattern, and they need a director to bring it out. And Cukor did a marvelous job of bringing out. I mean, he let him, for example, he let him do the songs live, which wasn't done much in Hollywood in that era. And he put a little microphone in his tie so he could do this. He had this speak-sing style of speaking and singing his lines that he developed with a vocal coach, and he made it a kind of a trademark of his. Cukor helped him do that. But the tone of the performance is so beautifully done that actually at the end of the play, at the end of the film, you kind of believe that they should be together in some way. It's an unconventional relationship.
It really is.
It's not your typical love relationship. It's a play, a musical in which there's no love song, no love scene.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of camaraderie and friendship and warmth but he's quite cruel and tyrannical too. And he has to, one point I make is that two people are transformed in My Fair Lady. Henry Higgins and Eliza are both become better people. But
good point. Yeah.
Collaborating, and Cukor was his art is so much about collaboration. And I saw Harrison was the only Cukor actor I saw do his role on stage, and I wasn't around in 1956. I was only 9 years old, but you can listen to the recordings of the London and New York versions of the play. But I saw Harrison do it around 1981 or thereabouts. He was on tour. He did it at the Pantages Theater in Hollywood, which is where the Stars Born world premiere took place, by the way. But Harrison was just terrible in the play. I mean, he had done it so often that he literally was walking through the play.
He was probably bored of it.
Bored out of his mind. And you could tell, and it was kind of contemptuously not acting, and he was just kind of, it wasn't the kind of non-acting that Cukor liked. It was just doing his lines and walking around and not relating to, you brought up a really good point that a lot of acting is relating to the other person, Spencer Tracy had famous advice for actors when they were to ask him how to act, and he would say, just know your lines and don't bump into the furniture is one thing he would say. But he also said, look at the other person and really listen.
Yeah.
Gene Simmons said that Tracy really listened. She said most actors act listening. They act listening, but he really listened. And she felt she was with him, when they were doing the parts as father and daughter. But Harrison was kind of off on his own, and it was really an object lesson in how bad an actor can be when he doesn't have a good director. And Gene Allen, who was the great production designer on My Fair Lady and other Cukor films, and Cukor was so modest that he told me, I asked him about Gene Allen, who started working with him on A Star Is Born and worked on all his films after that. And he said, well, I think my visual style got a lot better when I started working with Gene Allen. How many directors would say that about a collaborator?
No one.
Jeez. Yeah, nobody. Yeah.
I haven't heard anyone.
He worked with the greatest cinematographers too. And he was happy to share the glory. I asked Howard Hawks once, I said, why didn't you take writing credit on your movies after the early ones where your name sometimes appeared as a writer? And he said, because if I did, I couldn't get such good writers to work with me. That's very smart.
Right. Smart.
People like Capra started wanting credit, and good writers didn't want to work with him anymore because he was hogging their credit. But Gene Allen said, well, people think, sometimes people say, well, Cukor just put this musical on into a film, and that's easy to do, but it's
Yeah.
not. He
No.
said so many things can go wrong. It could become very stagey, or
Yeah.
it could become too different from the text. Sometimes when they do musicals today, they fragment the scenes where you don't see the whole body. Like Fred Astaire used to have in his contract, you had to see the whole body dancing. You couldn't cut away to reaction shots and things. But a lot of musicals now, they fragment the actors so much. The camera does the dancing, and so it gets away from what is really the material. But one of the key scenes in My Fair Lady is the Rain in Spain number, which is a glorious example of celebrating collaboration between Higgins and Eliza, and also Colonel Pickering, who's involved in her training too. And it's joyous, epiphany when she discovers that she can be a different kind of person. But what does it mean? It's about identity. That's another big theme of Cukor's work. What is your identity as a man, woman, or what class? I mean, Shaw's play is a satire of the British class system. And part of the point is you can learn all these things that make you seem to be a different class, but you're really still the person you were when you were born, But you can, class is a matter of acquired characteristics, the speech and behavior and manners. But I remember in 65, when I was starting to be exposed to that film, I was really unexpectedly moved by a line where Eliza tells Higgins's mother late in the film. She says, you see, Mrs. Higgins, the difference between a lady and a flower girl is not so much how she behaves, but how she is treated. I thought that was a very moving line.
Beautiful.
I felt that I was not treated well, partly because I was gauche and I didn't know how to behave, but also I was, bullied and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's very, very important how people treat you, and that's about social interaction, And so the actors in Cukor films really interact with each other, really look at each other and listen, and so much is in the interactions, and that's the director's job. So what the the auteur theory sort of obfuscates, because it's become kind of a commercial thing, like they use it to sell directors to the public. This is a Christopher Nolan film. It's a trademark, or a James Cameron film, and obviously they have a lot to do with it. But the writer is usually the person who's forgotten in the whole equation. Or how many people know cinematographers?
Yes.
Or production designers. These people are extremely important, and Cukor always would give them credit. So I write about those people too, and their contributions to the whole piece. But his visual style was extremely adventurous too, and the later films are just wonderful in terms of the visual style becomes more and more elaborate. Travels with My Aunt is a marvelous film to look at. Justine, which is kind of a patchy film that he came in, and the first director was fired, and he sort of salvaged the film, but it's stunning visually. The great Leon Shamroy photographed that, and it's Cukor's camera vision was rapturous. And he worked with George Hoyningen-Huene, was a great fashion photographer. Cukor became friends with him and brought him into his film world to be his color consultant. So the use of color in the Cukor films from 1954 onward, Bowani Junction, Lay Girls, My Fair Lady, the color is stunning in those films. But anyways, so much richness in Cukor's work that is apparent when you really start watching them all together, and you realize one guy made all these films.
Right. It's just one last question I had was it's always interesting for me when you look at a director like Cukor, who knew how to work so well within the Hollywood system, where ultimately they're given films to do on assignment, yet we still see movie after movie, similar themes, similar characters, similar relationships. So, I mean, I know the book is not all of his movies. It's probably, focusing on his best ones. But did he, how is it that you can work under the studio system but still tell such personal stories? I mean, did he hear about certain things happening and he went after them? And I know he developed scripts with writers. I mean, could you talk a little bit about his process and just getting work?
Yeah, that's a big part of, understanding golden age directors, Ford, Cukor, Hawks, Hitchcock.
Yeah.
I mean, Andre Bazin had that famous phrase, the genius of the system, which is sometimes misunderstood, but there's a good book by Thomas Schatz called The Genius of the System, which is about studio styles. Each studio had a kind of a signature in those days. And after the studios kind of collapsed in the 60s, there is no studio style anymore, but there certainly was an MGM style and a Paramount style, et cetera, and you can see that. But Cukor did 22 films for MGM, and they were known for elegance and great range of stars that he could choose from, and they were very financially successful, so they could afford to get great properties. And but My Fair Lady was a Warner Brothers film. Jack Warner paid a record $5.5 million for the rights to the musical. And it was a plum for Cukor to get to direct that, but he was the right guy to do it. But Cukor had a certain amount of say, and he would make it known that he wanted to direct Dinner at 8 or Little Women or, Philadelphia Story, which Hepburn developed with the playwright Philip Berry, and then she wanted Cukor to direct it. And so he had a certain clout there, but he often had to do assignments too, like any director in the studio system. And he did some clunkers, Her Cardboard Lover, boy, what a bad title. A Two-Faced Woman, Greta Garbo's last film, is very uneven, not very good. And Her Cardboard Lover is Norma Shearer's last film, but he had made The Women, which is a terrific film. Really good. Hit film, a hit play by Claire Booth Luce, but it's a very misogynistic play. And but he and his screenwriters transformed it into a kind of a feminist work, and it's got something like 135 women and no men in the film, and it's just a marvelous film full of women. Only Cukor could have done so well with that film, and to keep the tone going and all the different kind of women and performances that he dealt with. He was one thing that's reductive about Cukor, a lot of people have heard, is they would call him a women's director. And that line was promoted a lot by MGM when he did The Women. And certainly he directed so many great actresses, Hepburn and Garbo and, Norma Shearer and Rosalind Russell and Ava Gardner, it goes on and on, but it became kind of a code word for gay. Everybody in Hollywood knew that he was gay, and most people didn't care, but the public didn't know much about him. But sometimes people would use it to sneer. And I remember in the 60s when I started writing about films that I was really bothered by the fact that women's pictures was a pejorative term.
Right.
People would say about John Ford's Seven Women, well, it's a woman's picture. It's about women, a bunch of women, and that meant that it wasn't as important as a male action picture or something. And
which later became what people would call chick flicks, another, misogynistic term.
Yeah, you hear that. I mean, I heard that from students sometimes. One guy in one of my classes said, well, I don't like chick flicks. And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? And he said, well, my girlfriend would drag me to a film. That's a chick flick, And so that still lives. But on the other hand, we've learned a lot about how so-called women's pictures have a lot to say about society. And social mores and all that. And so people have reevaluated that whole kind of film. But he also did, as he often pointed out, he was quite acerbic about it, that he directed many great men, John Barrymore and James Mason and Spencer Tracy, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
But famously or infamously, he was fired from Gone with the Wind, partly for homophobic reasons, because Clark Gable, according to Pat McGilligan's biography, at one point made a homophobic remark on the set. He says, "I want to be directed by a real man," which is, Cukor walked off the set, and it was very hurtful to him. But Victor Fleming, who was brought in to replace him, was a kind of a He-Man kind of guy who, typical Hollywood director, would sleep with the leading ladies and stuff. And one reason actresses like to work with Cukor was he wouldn't be hitting on them.
Right.
He would treat them with respect. But Fleming told John Lee Mann, who was a screenwriter who I interviewed with Todd McCarthy, Fleming said, it's bullshit that Cukor is just a woman's director. He can direct anybody. He said, "I'm sure George would have done just as good a job as me if he had gone all the way through Gone with the Wind." And he said, "I think I did well with some of the big action scenes, but Cukor would have done better with a lot of the dialogue scenes." And, he had great respect for Cukor, and most people in Hollywood did, but there was still this label that he was a woman's director. But he did get some of the best properties and best stars, and stars wanted to work with him, because they knew he would bring out their best. There were very few stars who didn't want to work with him, and so his ability to thrive in the Hollywood system was one of his great strengths. He could call on the best cinematographers, art directors, editors, all these people who were so wonderful. And I did a book called The Book of Movie Lists once, and I had two lists. One, 10 things that were terrible about the studio system, and then another list, 10 things that were wonderful about the studio system. And even back then, John Huston said, we all complained about the studio system when it existed, but now we look back and we think, well, it was a pretty good system. I mean, they had all these writers under contract. I mean, like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Donald Ogden Stewart were among the writers of The Women without credit, and Anita Loos worked on it, and Jane Murfin, and great screenwriters, and they had all these stars and cinematographers under contract, etc. And so Cukor thrived in that system, and but he was a survivor. He was a tough guy, and a story that I just love. When I first interviewed him in 1975, he had just come back from Russia, where he made The Bluebird, which was a big disaster that he did. Everything went wrong on that film, but he was resilient. And I was interviewing him for the Directors Guild magazine, and I said to him, I was trying to get his feelings about this debacle, and I said, "What's it like to be fired from a picture?" I mean, he wasn't fired from that film, but I was thinking of a film called Desire Me, where he was fired, and 3 other directors worked on it, and nobody would take credit on it. But he leaned over to his publicist, and he put his hand on my forearm, and he said, "Notice with what finesse he avoids mentioning the title Gone with the Wind." And I wasn't actually thinking of Gone with the Wind, but he survived being fired from Gone with the Wind. And when he would read that a director was fired from a picture for decades, he would call the guy up and say, "Hey, sorry to hear you were fired, but hey, I was fired from the biggest picture of all time, and it didn't hurt my career. I kept going, and I'm doing well, and you'll survive this." And he was a survivor, and he kept working for about 5 decades, which was, I did a story for Variety when he did Rich and Famous, his last film. He was the oldest director ever to do a feature in Hollywood at that time for a major studio. He was 81 years old, and I said, "What did you think of that article?" And he said, "I was thrilled." Because most people, if you write about their age or their health or whatever, they go crazy. But he thought, he was so proud of that fact, But he did that because he was a survivor, and he kind of had to go along with certain humiliations. Star is Born, his greatest film, was hacked up. That was really painful. And Bowani Junction was mutilated, and even the actress, they took stuff out of that. And I mean, you suffered certain things in the studio system, but you also had a lot of advantages. And So he represents the genius of the system. But I was once interviewing George Stevens, and he was saying no good director lasted at MGM. He was talking about an unhappy experience he had at MGM, and I didn't, for some reason, didn't think of Cukor, but I said, what about Clarence Brown? And he was one of the great directors at MGM. And Stevens smiled and he said, Clarence Brown was a marvelous director. He said, So there were people like Clarence Brown and Cukor who navigated the MGM system and thrived. Cukor was not a particular favorite of Louis B. Mayer, who was pretty much a jerk in many ways, but he survived, all the ups and downs, and they respected him. People had great respect for him, and he had to toe the line in certain ways, both personally and professionally, but he got away with a lot too. And this subversive quality, the subtlety of doing things that the censors didn't even realize. Sometimes that was Billy Wilder's. That was one of the. He said actually the code and the censorship actually worked in our favor to some extent because it made you more clever. You were trying to outwit the system, and get away with stuff. And Cukor got away with a tremendous amount of stuff, but he also had the elegance and entertainment value that the studios required, and so his films are triumphant works of collaboration within the system, but he's a strong creator within that system, and that's what I write about in George Cukor's People. I try to define who is this man, and what are the common denominators, and what are the unique things he brings to each relationship with each of the many different kinds of actors that he worked with.
Well, you certainly succeeded at that. Because as I said, it's a wonderful book. And again, it's called George Cukor's People, Acting for a Master Director. And you mentioned that the ebook is out already, but the physical copy will be out on January, is it the 6th or 7th, I believe?
January 7th. They set a pub date a little later after the books start hitting the stores. And the book started coming out on December 20th from Amazon. People started shipping the book and just in time for Christmas, and but they usually wait a couple of weeks for the official pub date when reviews are supposed to appear, so that everybody has access to the book. Because when people read a review and they think, oh, I want to read this book, and they can't find it, they get kind of irritated, and then they may not want to buy the book. But so January 7th is the official publication date, but it's out there and people can buy it now from Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and Columbia University Press website has the book. And I've done 3 books for them now. I did my How Did Lubitsch Do It? And Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, with the editor John Belden, who's been there a long time, who's a great scholar himself, and he edits a terrific series of film books. And Philip Leventhal, the editor supervising the projects, and he's wonderful to work with. And Elliot Cairns, who did a great job of designing the book, and it's a beautiful book. I tried to make it a kind of art object in a way like Cukor films. So I hope people enjoy it. I had a lot of fun writing it. I think that comes across.
Oh, certainly. Well, Joseph, thank you again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm sure we'll plan something else for the new year to have you back. So thank you so much again for coming on.
Thank you, Robert. It's always a joy, and I really appreciate your good research, and I love hearing about films you've discovered in the course of your research and what your reactions are to Sylvia Scarlett and My Fair Lady and other films like that. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, and thank you all for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/RobertBellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation, or what I call a tip, by clicking the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on that and you can leave a donation if you choose to. Of course, I would greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the Movie logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. I would also really appreciate if you leave a comment, share the video, like the video. All of these things create traction onto my YouTube channel and really help share the video far and wide and the channel in general. So thank you so much for doing that, and I will see you all in the next one.